We've talked about all the characters that came to play between the two great wars. So let's take a look at World War II now. Make sure you mark down the years, 1939 to 1945. But I do want to take a side note and make sure that you understand that that is not the same years as the Holocaust. The Holocaust actually began in 1933 and will end in 1945 when the camps are liberated. So you also need to take note of those years. Let's look at some of the causes of World War II, and we're going to go into detail with many of these. So you can read them off the screen. Aggression by totalitarian powers, such as Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, you know all the big names. Tendency towards isolationism and pacifism is America. We were turning a blind eye to what was going on. Too many of us remembered what it was like to be in World War I. We had brothers, fathers, husbands that fought and sometimes died in the trenches of World War I, and just were not ready to relive that. We talked a lot about the Treaty of Versailles and the failures that came out of it, and the big thing, of course, was the way that Germany was treated, stripped of her military, which was the big thing all the way back to Frederick the Great. So to strip Germany of their military was a huge slap in the face. And then, of course, we were charging them monstrous amounts of money. When I say we, I really mean the Allies. We talked about how America tried to help that out, but it ended up playing a big part in the Great Depression. Weakness in the League of Nations, of course, they had a really good idea of how to keep peace in the world, but no mechanism to actually make it work. You couldn't force people to come to the rescue. And of course, here in this case, you have Hitler, who is going to start taking over territory, and nobody in the League of Nations was willing to step forward and stop him, and that leads me to appeasement. The people in Europe were appeasing Hitler as he started taking land. They would rather just allow him to take bits and pieces here and there rather than say, okay, let's start another war and stop this guy. And it's going to get out of hand very quickly. And then, of course, you have radical nationalism. Hitler is a really good person to talk about for this. Of course, this goes all the way back to our friend Napoleon, but Hitler was a master at using nationalism and love of the mother country of Germany to get his people behind him. Hitler took over several areas before anybody even really raised an eyebrow. And of course, he used the excuse that he was bringing his people home. We talked about this in the interwar period. So you can see the territories that he took over, and I'll show you a map in a minute so you can see how on a map it actually kind of makes sense. He took over a territory called the Rhineland, which was actually a part of Germany at one time, and the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia, also once a part of the German territory. Austria and Germany had always been friends. So a lot of those people really associated with the German culture. And all of this was okay it was easy for Hitler to say, I'm bringing my people home, because these were people that were German at some time, or maybe even still consider themselves German. So you see in Volk and Reich und Führer, one people, one government, one leader, was what he recited over and over and over again in a prelude to, yes, I'm bringing my people home. You see in the bottom corner here, parade. This is what he did whenever he took over a new territory. He held extravagant parades, and he told the media of the world that this was the people that he was taking over is doing, not his, that they were so happy to be back home with their real country and their true leader that they held this big bash for him. And of course it wasn't them, it was him. The lady off to the side, another media splash for him. He took pictures such as this and told the world that she was just overcome with happiness. You can see her raising her hand to her new Führer. She is just, sobbing with joy that she's going to have the leader that she's always wanted. In truth, there was a man standing behind her with a gun saying, you will salute your new Führer. But the world didn't see it that way. They saw it the way that Hitler wanted them to see it, as a woman overcome with joy. So you can see in this picture here, the pink and red areas are the areas that he started taking over. And you can see the Rhineland was actually part of Germany at one time. It was lost because of the Treaty of Versailles boundaries that were created. The same with the Sudetenland. Sudetenland was at one time actually part of Germany. So it made sense, really, when people looked at it on the map. Oh, okay, he took the Rhineland, he took the Sudetenland. Who cares? They were actually German to begin with. So not enough to start a war over. Austria, too, again, they were friends. They had been friends for a very, very long time. It didn't seem threatening that he was taking over the territories. So while all this is going on, of course, Europe is appeasing him or giving him what he wants. And again, that term appeasement simply means that, giving him what he wants to shut him up and make him go away. It's like giving a screaming child the toy that they're screaming for, or the cupcake that they're screaming for, just to shut them up. And America, again, not wanting to go back into a war, is just pretending it's not happening. We're closing our eyes and screaming peace and love and letting people do what they want because it's not our business. So while all this is happening, Hitler is still creeping across the continent of Europe, taking places over. This is what the map is going to look like in Europe by the time that Hitler is at his peak of takeover. And it's scary when you look at it like this. So the deep red is everything that he literally took over. He removed people from power, put his own people there, and of course he was the leader. He just had people doing what he wanted in those dark red areas. And in the pink areas, they were puppet regimes. So the leaders of those countries or territories were allowed to stay in the seat of power, but they had to ask permission from Hitler before they could do anything. So they really were under the power of Germany. Look at this. This is unbelievable that one man in such a quick amount of time, he's only been in power for 6 years by the time the map looks like this. It's scary to think that somebody could take that much land that quickly and nobody was doing anything about it. And of course, Hitler once more, and there's Stalin there with him too. Happy couple. So they signed what was called the Non-Aggression Pact, and we talked about this in the interwar period. Germany and the Soviet Union were not partners in war or partners in battle in any way whatsoever. They just made this pact to stay out of each other's way. And they agreed that they would divide Poland. Both of them wanted Poland for the minerals that existed there. So they agreed which side each country would take, where the boundary line would be. They did it, and they went their separate ways. So they are not partners in any way whatsoever, but they signed this pact not to attack each other. So Stalin kind of walked away from this as the innocent-looking one. And it's hard to believe that nobody really jumped all over him for taking part of Poland. Poor Poland has disappeared from the map a lot of times. But Hitler and Stalin made this agreement, and of course this picture that you see, this comedy picture, went all over the world. I wonder how long the honeymoon will last. I'm sure Stalin was very, very happy that he got to be the bride in it. But again, they're not partners. They just kind of had an agreement not to attack each other. Hitler knew that it would be very, very easy to take over Poland. He had no worries whatsoever that the deed could be done. So when he invaded on September 1st, 1939, he decided to use the takeover to experiment with a new form of military strategy called the Blitzkrieg. Translated into English, that means lightning war. And basically what it means is to decide the territory that you're going to take over, and you just bombard it from land, from air, from sea, with everything you have until one of two things happens. Either everyone is dead, or the enemy gives up unconditionally. So this is his practice. He's going to do this in Poland, knowing that it would be an easy takeover. He just wanted to see if his men could pull it off and how efficient they would be. And this is the guys that were fighting against the Blitzkrieg. These are the poor Polish people. Not much of a military. As I said, they've been wiped off the map several times, and it seems like the people of Poland were just always busy rebuilding. So this is kind of the best of the best. These are their cavalrymen here in the front. You see some foot soldiers in the back. And if you notice the weapons that they're holding, they're spears. They're still very rudimentary in their military power, and Hitler knew it, but he still just wiped them out and terrified the world. And there's my pretty grandfather clock to introduce that moment in history. Sorry. So once the deed was done and Poland was wiped from the map, Britain and France decided that it was time to give up this strategy of appeasement, that Hitler was just going to keep taking land and taking land, duh. So on September 3rd, 1939, just right after the invasion took place in Poland, they declared war against Germany, and the Second World War had begun. Now, we are not going to be in it yet. I don't have a page for this, but I want you to understand this. We did not declare war in 1939, but very shortly afterwards, we will start lending or leasing military equipment to Britain and to France, but France was pretty much overtaken very quickly, so more Britain than anybody. It was FDR's way of getting us into the war without actually being in the war. So Britain needed ships and planes and things like that, so we gave them everything, including food, everything short of soldiers. So it was FDR's way of being part of the war without actually getting into the war. He was trying to ease us into it. As a great leader, FDR knew that we were the big dogs on the planet, and if this war was going to be as massive as everybody expected it to be, we couldn't stay uninvolved. If we didn't get involved at the end of the war, we would be looked at as cowards that didn't help our friends, and we would not be the big dogs anymore. But you can't tell that to citizens who still remember a war that was horrible, and America wasn't willing to fight it. So the Lend-Lease program was his way of slowly dipping our toes in it. So again, if you were ever asked on a test, hint, 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 what German action officially started World War II, you would say the invasion of Poland. So for 9 months, nothing happens. People actually started calling this war the Phony War, and that's Phony. And they did it because they thought that maybe that's all Hitler wanted. Maybe he really did just want Poland. 9 months with nothing, and then all of a sudden, sort of kind of out of the blue, Hitler decides that he's going to use blitzkrieg on France, and it was very, very successful. So from September of 1939 to June of 1940, nothing, and then suddenly there's blitzkrieg in France, and there's Hitler. This picture to me is just scary, horrible scary. Hitler standing in front of the Eiffel Tower, it's his. So this is when the world started to go on alert. Hitler was not done. He had taken over France. Here's some pictures, and if you keep clicking, you'll see this is what France looked like after the blitzkrieg. Bodies, buildings. You see a picture of a church where a priest is trying to hold service and the people gathering around the altar. Some of these pictures are actually true-to-life pictures that a friend of mine brought in from his grandfather. His grandfather was in France after the blitzkrieg event and took these actual pictures. So they're mixed in with some Google pictures as well, but some of them are from an individual that was actually there, standing there. It's the great-great-grandfather of a teacher friend of mine. All right, so you have to ask yourself, if you are going to, if you're the neighbor of a country as strong as France, and you just got word that they've been taken over by Hitler, what do? You have to prepare yourself that you're probably going to be next. So in Britain, they did take that attitude that they were probably going to be next. So in the face of mass destruction, they decided that they had to figure out a way to take care of their children. You have to remember Europe they have a different mentality about war. Some of their wars have gone on for hundreds of years. World War I to European people was like a tiny drop in the bucket. The Crusades went on for 127 years. You have the 100 Years' War. So they really, really thought that this could be one of those wars that would go on forever and forever. Remember, we talked about Hitler training his children to be in his Hitler Youth program because he figured they would grow up and be his soldiers or the mothers of soldiers. Britain kind of takes that attitude too, and they created a program called Operation Pied Piper. If you don't know who the Pied Piper is, in Ireland there is a story that there was a town in Ireland that was overrun by rats. And there was this man that claimed that he could get rid of the rats for a large fee. And the rats had become a really big problem. They were biting people in their sleep. They were destroying crops. They were eating houses. People needed to get rid of them. So, of course, they promised this man, if you can get rid of them, we'll give you whatever you want. So he had developed this song that he played on the flute. And when he played the song, all the rats of the town gathered at his feet. And he simply marched them out of town, playing his flute, and they all marched with him. So he gets rid of the rats and he comes back and he wants his money. Ireland is very poor. They don't really have the money to pay him. So they say, sorry, the rats are gone. We don't need you. Be on your way. Well, he had also developed a second song that worked on children. So the children gathered at his feet when he played his tune, and he simply marched them out of town. He got rid of all the children. So this was named after that story, Operation Pied Piper. And what they did was they decided that they would get all the children out of the main cities and take them out into the country to protect them, so that in the future they could grow up to be soldiers. They didn't want this whole generation wiped out because it would mean that they would lose in the end. So they had to save the children. And posters like this went up all over town because after the phony war, the 9 months of the phony war, the government of Britain didn't want people to think that, okay, it's going to be another 9 months. This is urgent. We have to do something now. You have to get rid of your children. Can you imagine your government saying that to you? Put your child on a train, no parents allowed, and ship them off to the country. But that's what Britain did. They were desperate and worried that they had to save the children. So you would have seen pictures like this in the Operation Pied Piper. Literally children down at the train station. You put a ticket on them, and the ticket said one of two things. Either it told an address where the child was to go if you had a relative or a friend in the country willing to take them, or it might say something on it to convince people to take your child. This is what would happen. The train had many, many stops, and at every stop, all the children would get off in the countryside, and the farmers would gather at the train station, and they would kind of check the kids out, read what's on their tag, things like, I'm a hard worker, I don't eat much, I'm very quiet, I'm very respectful, things like that. And the farmers would take some of the kids home with them to help them work on the farm. If you were a child that was not chosen, you were put back on the train to go to the next stop. At the end, when all the stops were gone, whatever children were left at the end of the train was a orphanage, and the remainder of the children were dropped off there. Now, this program did not work as efficiently as they had hoped that it would. Lots of the kids made it to their destination, and they were safe, and after the war they were returned to their parents, but other children were lost in the shuffle. Paperwork wasn't always done in the way that it should. Some of the kids were dropped off at certain towns, and it wasn't recorded. So trying to find your child at the end of the Operation Pied Piper program for some parents turned out to be a nightmare. And their original thought even of putting your baby on a train and saying goodbye, and I can't even imagine, but that's what they did. Here's one of the actual tickets, and of course you can tell here that this was a child that had a destination. So the address where the child was supposed to go was printed out on it, and the signatures that you see are people that handed the child over, and then the person who picked the child up to say, yes, this kid made it to their destination, everything is okay. So you can see it's not super efficient, it's just a hand signature and an address. So it's not efficient and kind of a scary thought. So they were not wrong. There is going to be a giant battle. It is going to be the first air battle of the war. Actually, it's the first air battle ever, and it's called the Battle of Britain. And again, Hitler tried to use blitzkrieg, but we had worked with Britain to develop a new device called radar. Germany was not aware of this, so you could tell when you looked at the machine where the planes were in the sky, and you could meet the enemy planes and take them down. So you see that the man on the left-hand side of the screen is looking at the machine, and it's got little blips on it to tell him where the planes are, and then he reports it to the British pilots so that they can meet the enemy. If you look over here on the right-hand side, that's actual radar station, and you can see this how big it is by the size of the barrel at the bottom. That's like an oil barrel. It is a monstrous, giant piece of equipment, but the Germans did not know what it was. They flew right over it. They didn't try and destroy it. They had no idea what it was. So the radar was actually telling the location of the enemy, and the enemy didn't know better to destroy it. So all the radar systems were kept in place, and Britain actually wins the Battle of Britain. Sometimes it's nicknamed the Blitz, short for Blitzkrieg. Britain is devastated. Their buildings are devastated, but they're actually going to win because of radar. That's one reason that they're going to win. The second reason that they're going to win, and the British people will tell you this, they attribute the win also to the actions and the words and the attitude of the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. And he gave this great announcement over the radio several times. It ran through every newspaper. And what he said in it was, "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight on the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender." And that got people up and going. So 1940 to 41, German and British air forces battled for months, but Britain successfully blocked Hitler's advances. Now, during this bombardment, Hitler's men actually miscalculated a couple of times. The goal was usually things like military bases. That was the big goal. Get rid of the military bases, blow up planes, go to the docks, blow up the boats. But because of the Blitzkrieg and the bombardment, it just ended up being that more civilian territory was destroyed than military territory. And the response to it was so astronomical, so demoralizing, that Hitler actually changed his goal after the Battle of Britain, that the target should be civilians. Now, I know that sounds evil, but the truth is that the Allied forces will do the same, because it is demoralizing. Think about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They were not military bases that we blew up. They were towns. So Hitler's kind of the one that takes that strategy, and then everybody else falls into suit with that. You demoralize them, kill their babies, kill their old people, kill their wives, and the men will not be able to fight because they won't be able to see beyond their grief, was kind of the attitude, and we all used it. So here's some pictures of kids that did stay in the towns. They're hiding in the trenches. They built bomb shelters, of course. And you can see some of these pictures after the Blitz, what Britain looked like. It was devastated, just like France. So when we get to the end of the war and we start talking about the legacy of the war, keep it in your mind, these pictures of France and Britain and how destroyed they were. Germany's going to look like this. Japan is going to look like this. So keep in your mind the territories that are just being demolished by bombs. So Hitler decides that England's not going to work. So he decides he's going to turn his eyes on the Soviet Union. Now remember, they had this pact with each other that they were not going to attack each other. Stalin never goes back on that pact. He never goes directly after Hitler's men to destroy them. Hitler, on the other hand, he does. So Hitler's defeat in Britain makes him go to the Soviet Union in 1941, but the Soviets had harsh Soviet winters on their side that Germans didn't know anything about. This sounds just like Napoleon. He did the same thing. So the Soviets, they don't chase the Germans, but they lure them in to fight in Stalingrad, and they keep them there for months. The Germans not knowing how to survive a Soviet winter, and hundreds of thousands of Germans are going to die as the temperatures fall. But Hitler ordered no retreat. No retreat. No surrender. And by March of 1943, now this is 2 years later, March of 1943, Moscow was saved, and 500,000 Germans lost their lives. 500,000 Germans gone. So this is the turning point of the war, and the Germans are never going to recover from this. Make sure you know Stalingrad, the Battle of Stalingrad, as the turning of the tables. Germany just never comes back from this. And you can see the harsh winters in these pictures here. Imagine fighting on frozen ground like this. Just terrible, terrible. So, we haven't yet talked about Japan. The goal, of course, originally is going to be to take Hitler down. That's the goal of the entire war. The Japanese, of course, were part of the Axis powers, but we kind of ignored what Japan was doing. And Japan actually started war actions before war was declared in 1939. And you can see here that Japan actually invaded China in 1937, before war was actually declared. And they were already working their way through China, which is war actions, very early. And it didn't take long for Japan to really come to her own and become this great military power, but the world was just turning a blind eye. We were hypnotized by Hitler and terrified of what he was doing and watching his every move, and we were kind of ignoring what was happening in China and with Japan. So you can see the Japanese are parading through Nanjing. And Nanjing is a Chinese city. They had taken it, they're going to take it over, and I'll tell you more about the horrible things that's going to happen in Nanjing that we kind of ignore. But the Chinese were so terrified of the Japanese, and there was bombing going on in 1937, and you can see the picture here on the right hand side. There was they got word of bombing close by in Chongqing, and people started stampeding each other trying to find cover. So these people that you see on the steps were trampled to death. So this kind of stuff is going on in China, and everybody's ignoring it. I mean, the Chinese people are so terrified, they're trampling each other to death, and nobody's stepping in. The Chinese are just kind of left to their own, and the Japanese are left alone too to kind of do what they want to do. Now you can see in this picture that there are actually Americans in this picture. There are British in this picture. There are French in this picture. And the Japanese were already taking prisoners. Military people that were serving in China were being taken as prisoners before war was declared in 1939. So if the Japanese took over a territory, military men that were in that territory were captured as war criminals, even though it wasn't actually a war, and taken into some of the Japanese camps. So most of them were released after very little time. They weren't at the stage yet, Japan wasn't, where they wanted to really tick off these European countries or America. So the men were held for a while and released. But after the men were released, they started telling these stories about what they saw the Japanese doing in China, and they were horrible, terrifying stories. So that's what we're going to talk about next. All right, so some things that we did not know about Japan at first, but word is going to leak out after these guys are released. Two things. The rape of Nanjing. Yes, sometimes you'll see it spelled with a J, sometimes with a K. It's still pronounced Nanjing. So the rape of Nanjing and the comfort zones. Let's talk about the rape of Nanjing first. The Japanese invaded China, and they were slowly working their way down the coast. And Nanjing had not been hit yet, but they definitely knew that they were in the path of the Japanese. And Nanjing was a very, very rich city for the most part. So the rich left. They took their families, they packed up their stuff, and they left. So by the time that the Japanese got there, the only people left were the sick, the elderly, the poor. Not a good situation. They were totally undefended. And this is where you get an extreme case of mob mentality. The Chinese were just completely overrun by the Japanese, who had lost their minds. And they literally raped every female left in Nanjing that they could get their hands on. The ones that whether they raped you or not, they were still going to murder you. They raped brand new babies. They raped 80-year-old women. They took pregnant women and cut their children out of them, and just toyed with people and did horrible things to them. The men that were left behind, they didn't get by either. They were used as an initiation for new Japanese soldiers coming in, and they turned it into games to see how many times you had to whack at their heads before their heads were cut off with a machete, or they burned them alive and took bets on how long it would take for them to stop screaming. Just horrible, horrible things. The Asian culture is very unique in that they don't speak of things like this. The rape of Nanjing was a very, very private thing. There were citizens, British citizens, French citizens that were in Nanjing, and they tried to tell the rest of the world what was happening. Please send help. And people ignored them. And the Chinese and Japanese to this day do not like to talk about this. Women in Asian culture, especially during this time period, feel that rape is a fault of their own. It's not a man's fault, and it's a very private, embarrassing, and horrible thing that tarnished you for life and ruined you. You could never get married. You could never have children. You did not speak of it. So Iris Chang wrote a book called The Rape of Nanjing. It's a horrible book, but it is one that I think most people should read. It tells you the true story of the inhumanity of war and the horrible things that we can sometimes do to each other. She went to China and Japan and tried to talk to people about what had happened. None of the women would speak to her, none of them. She did find a few Japanese soldiers that had just been carrying this guilt around. It's like this mob mentality that when you're doing it, it's not even really you doing it. You see it, but you can't stop it, and it's you. That kind of thing. She talked to a few of them and got their firsthand accounts. Iris Chang, of course, was from Asian descent, and the book that she wrote, the pictures in it are just horrific. And she was given these pictures by some of the Japanese soldiers that had kept them in order for them to remember the horrible, horrible things that they had done, kind of as a self-punishment. And they gave her these pictures, and she had them published in her book. She was writing a sequel to the book. She had interviewed other people, and in the middle of that book, she drove out into the country and wrote a very long letter to her family saying that the pictures and the stories, because of these two books, were just stuck in her head and she couldn't get past them. Her whole life had become these visions of horror and terror and rape, and so she took her own life. She drove out into the country, wrote this note, and took her own life rather than have to think about it more. That's how horrible it is, and she was just writing it. She didn't live in it. So the Rape of Nanjing is a story that hasn't been told until recently because of Iris Chang. You wouldn't hear that in a history class 20 years ago. But the things that they did are things that the people involved never forgot and still don't speak about. And if you look at these pictures, these are the nicer of the pictures out of Iris Chang's book. You can see the heads that they put outside the city, and I cut off the one of them that they even put cigars in their mouths, making fun of them like they're smoking a cigar in death. Just horrible things. So that's the Rape of Nanjing. Nobody's doing anything about it. Word is being leaked out. Nobody's doing anything about it. And then we have the comfort zones. The Japanese realized that their men that were fighting for a very long time needed a place to go to relax, recuperate, just be in a place where they weren't worried about shooting people, that kind of thing. Just a place to relax. So they set up these territories all over China called comfort zones, and you were supposed to go there for like a few days leave to rest, to drink, to have sex, whatever to relieve the stress that you felt you were under. And at first they used Japanese female prisoners as the prostitutes in these comfort zone camps. But as the battle went on and more men were sent to China, especially after World War II officially started, they realized that they did not have enough female prisoners to send over to comfort all of the the Japanese soldiers in China. So they devised a new plan. They went to Korea, who was then and still is, North Korea, a devastated place financially, and the people there are so poor. I can't even explain to you how poor they are. And the Japanese went to them and said, "We will take your daughters." and we need nurses. So we're going to take them, we're going to train them to be nurses in the field. They're going to have a education that they would never have gotten without us, and we're going to make sure that some of their paycheck is sent home to you, so you'll actually have money. It sounds like a wonderful, wonderful deal. So Korean families were lining up at these buses begging them to take their daughters. And what was really happening is these girls were being sent into the comfort zones and being turned into prostitutes. And some of them were very, very young, 13, 14, 15 years old. The girls were not allowed to use their names. They were not allowed to even have a number. They were called the human toilets. And each girl was set up in a tent room with a bed and a chalkboard. And each girl was given a quota. It could be 3, it could be 20. And every time you comforted a man during the day, during your shift, he was to put a tick mark on your chalkboard and sign it. And at the end of the day, if you did not meet your quota, then you were punished or killed. If you got pregnant, that was a death sentence. And this just went on and on and on throughout the war. These young girls, the human body is not made, especially a female body, is not made to have sex 20 times a day, every day. So many of the women got infections, died very quickly, very painfully, and they were treated as trash, basically, the human toilets. These women, rape is rape, and these women still took the guilt upon themselves. Not a single comfort woman has ever come forward to have her story published. We've learned about this from some men who felt enough guilt to say something about it. We've learned about it through American GIs that saw it firsthand and told the story, but these women have stayed silent. Only now are they starting to actually speak out in the name of their grandmothers. Well, not even their grandmothers, because very few of them went on to have children. They were scarred for life. Just relatives that, down the line that felt like there should be some kind of peace for these women that went through what they went through. So these are some of the horrible things that were happening in China at the hand of Tojo. He is the one that set up the comfort zones. He visited Nanjing while the rape was going on and allowed it to happen, thought it was good for morale. Not a nice guy. So as depressing as that is, there is the rape of Nanjing and the comfort zones, and nothing was being done. We had no idea that the Japanese were doing such things, and if we did, we were kind of denying it. So let's look at our part with the Japanese. The Japanese, of course, like I said, had invaded China, and Chinese delegates were pleading with our president, FDR, please do something about it. So President Roosevelt agreed to sponsor peace talks on the condition that the Japanese would leave China. He was opening a door to get the Japanese out of China peacefully. Tojo would not even speak with him. So at the time, we were giving Japan about 80% of their oil, 80%. And when Tojo refused to speak with President Roosevelt, Roosevelt placed an embargo on all the oil and steel shipments. Now, in war, you need steel too. So an embargo on oil and steel shipments to Japan in 1941. So suddenly, Japan's not getting any oil, which means no gas. So imagine what it would do to us if suddenly we were told by all the powers of the world, no more oil, you're not getting any more. Imagine the desperation, and this is what Japan was going through. Japan was both angry and very desperate. And you have to know that something's going to happen when you do something that severe. FDR had to know you can't embargo oil, especially in a time of war, and expect that everything's going to be okay. So this is 1941. The war is officially on, and that we're telling Japan no more oil. Scary thought. And so after the embargo was put into place, of course Japan is going to strike out, hoping that they can change things and get gas. So Japan, this is how they viewed us. Right here, I love this quote. Tojo said this. The U.S. fleet in Hawaii was a dagger pointed at our throat that must be destroyed. And so they did declare war on the United States. I'm sorry, we declared war on them the next day. And if you would click on the YouTube address down there, you will hear what FDR said to America. So in order to understand what happened at Pearl Harbor a little bit better, I have not only pictures here, but I have a map of the Hawaiian Islands so that you can get a really good idea of what was going on here. Pearl Harbor is actually an island inside of the island of Oahu. And you can see here in the black and white picture at the top that that's the island. That is Pearl Harbor. And you can see in the map at the top, I've circled Oahu. And you can see at the bottom that little inlet there. It's a natural opening, and the island that is Pearl Harbor is located inside that natural opening. The idea was that this was the ideal place to have a base because it would be safe. It would be hard for the enemy to come in and do anything without somebody knowing about it. So this is still early on when it was developed that planes weren't the thing of the day. So of course by this time period when Pearl Harbor is actually struck, planes are a pretty big deal, and they have perfected them and they're used quite often. So you can see here that the statistics of what happened that day. It was a Sunday morning. The Japanese had researched, Tojo specifically, had researched Americans and knew quite a bit about them. And they realized, number one, Sunday was a day of rest. Still, in the 1940s, we still considered Sunday to be a holy day. Many people did. The Bible Belt was alive and well, and that was a day of rest. Also, on top of that, and Tojo knew this as well, Saturday night was a very big night for military guys especially. They went out, they drank a lot, and by Sunday morning they were tired, hungover, slept late. A lot of them were not on their posts the next day, or were hungover or sleeping there. So Tojo was right. Sunday was the day to strike if you wanted the men to not be on their full alert. So in the attack, these are the things that got lost. You can see the numbers here: 188 U.S. aircraft destroyed, 8 battleships, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, all sunk. And then you see the death tolls there as well, which was very high. Here's the odd thing. This is a day of rest. Ships did not do maneuvers on Sundays back then. In Oahu, there were aircraft carriers, and if you don't know what one is, here's a picture of one. It's a very large ship, large enough for planes to take off from and land on in the middle of the ocean. And Tojo knew very well that if you wanted to fight a ocean battle, which is what this was going to be between America and Japan, you had to have aircraft carriers to do so. You had to be able to take these planes out in the middle of the ocean and have them disembark from the boat. So if you don't have aircraft carriers, you're not going to be very effective at fighting a water battle. So his goal was to destroy aircraft carriers. But guess what? On this particular Sunday, for some reason, who knows why, aircraft carriers were not there at Pearl Harbor. They had all been sent out to sea on maneuvers, which was a very odd thing. This kind of leads theorists to believe that perhaps FDR was well aware of what was coming and allowed it to happen in order for him to gain the support that he needed for America to be fully engulfed in this war and for Congress to actually declare war. So who knows? It's a theory. We're probably never going to know the real truth about it, but there it is. We did get involved in the war, and if you change to the next page, you'll hear more about that. So the United States is going to enter the war on December 8th, the day after Pearl Harbor. FDR went to Congress basically in the middle of the night and said, I want to declare war, and they unanimously said yes. So the plan originally, as was the plan for Europe in the beginning, was to take down Hitler first, and then they would worry about Japan. So even though Japan has been doing all these evil things for several years now, and people are starting to understand that Tojo is a force to be reckoned with, they still didn't really fully grasp his intentions or his ability. So the plan will remain for us to help Europe take down Hitler first, and then worry about Tojo later.
Now, just because the plan was to go after Hitler first and take him down, it doesn't mean that we didn't have any battles between America and the Japanese in that time period. We definitely did. Not very long after the event at Hawaii, there was a man by the name of Chester Nimitz. Chester Nimitz is the guy who broke the Japanese code. And shortly after Pearl Harbor, there's another conspiracy theory for you. The guy had been working on it forever, and suddenly Pearl Harbor blows up, and Chester knows how to read their code. So it could be another conspiracy theory. Who knows? But anyway, Chester Nimitz is the guy who broke the Japanese code, and when he broke it, we realized that the next wave of attack from the Japanese was going to happen at an island you see here on the map, not too far from Hawaii, called Midway. And so basically, we went to the island of Midway, the American forces did, and we sat on the far side of the island. And when the Japanese showed up on June 4th, 1942, we surprise attacked them. And so, America and Japan, we both had aircraft carriers. We are going to lose one of them, but Japan's going to lose all of theirs. And they will absolutely never recover from this. This is that turning point where they just cannot recover from it. This is also the time or the battle that made us realize what the Japanese were willing to do. So the Japanese got 3 of our guys in this water battle. We got 35 of theirs. Now, we took their men, we treated them well. I mean, they're prisoners, sure, but we didn't do anything bad to them. We just took them into custody until we could exchange, make arrangements for an exchange. And so on the given day and time, we brought the 35 Japanese prisoners to exchange, and our guys were not there. The 3 that they took were not there. In that same day, we pulled 3 barrels out of the ocean and opened them, and each one contained the chopped up body of those 3 men. And so we realized what the Japanese are willing to do, capable of doing, and this is when we start to realize that this is not a little tiny island to deal with. This is a major power, and a very dangerous major power. And so it's time for us to wake up. Thank you, Chester Nimitz.
So, Japan, I just want you to understand how strong they were, how far they got before anybody could put a stop to it. Japan's military leaders, Tojo specifically, more than Hirohito, Tojo wanted to build an empire. And after Korea and Manchuria and the rest of China, Japan thought that they could take the rich European colonies to Southeast Asia. And you see here on the map, they did that. Everything in orange is things that were taken over by the Japanese. Their next goal was Australia. And you can see the Indonesia there with Java and Borneo. All those places, New Guinea, the Philippines, all those places were strongholds of European countries. Some of them were strongholds of America, where our fleets or European fleets were heavily protecting these islands. Japan sailed right through them. And they made it right off the coast of Australia, and at the coast of Australia is where they started having problems. Believe it or not, they ran out of gas. So boats were sitting still in the water. By the end of the war, their planes are going to be sitting still. They are truly going to run out of gas, but that's still a little ways off. So the military goal was to take over all these places, and Tojo successfully did take them over. So if nothing else, even if you don't talk about Nanjing, if you don't talk about the comfort zones, you still have to understand that Tojo knew what he was doing, and he and his men were very good at getting the job done. We still need to take a look at what's happening in America. Once Pearl Harbor took place, and I often wonder if this was a plan of FDR's, if he really thought this part through. But Americans started to become really suspicious of anybody Asian. And you know Americans are stupid when it comes to the Asian world. We have a really hard time telling Japanese from Chinese, from Korean, from Vietnamese. We just do. So if you were Asian, or even look like you might sort of possibly have some Asian blood in you, suddenly you were under a microscope, and overnight you were the hated population of America. So you can see some of these cartoons and some of the headlines that came out at the time. They're horrible things, horrible, horrible things. And hysteria was everywhere. And you can see this newspaper article. I love this. A stray weather balloon and flares triggered an anti aircraft barrage and blacked out the city. And these people are saying that it was the Japanese people living here that were doing it. So it just things got worse and worse and worse for people of Asian culture. Again, you can see more signs that went up all over the place. How horrible is this? White man's neighborhood. Japs keep on moving. The ouster of all Japs in California near. And this is running in newspapers, public newspapers, not little teeny tiny privately owned once every 2 month kind of newspapers. This is the everyday newspaper. They were openly saying, get out. How horrible is that for these people that have been here for generations? Some of them's great 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 grandfathers helped to build the Transcontinental Railroad in the 1860s, and suddenly they are the enemy of the state. So here's the order that was officially signed by FDR in 1942. So it's the very next year after Pearl Harbor. Executive Order 9066 ordered the containment by law of all Asian Americans in what's called internment camps. Now, he said his excuse for it was that he was protecting the Asian people from what the American people were willing to do to them. He was trying to put out a fire before there was one. But the Japanese did not see it that way. And of course, a lot of other people didn't see it that way either. They saw it as you're containing them because they're the enemy. And the Japanese didn't like being called the enemy. And can you blame them? I mean, they were treated like criminals for doing nothing. Images like this were everywhere. Asians were stripped of everything that they had. They were allowed one bag. Their homes were taken from them and sold at auction. The money was used to help fight the war. Their cars, their businesses, their clothes off their back. They had one bag per person, and that was the maximum. And these people were loaded on trains and shipped to internment camps in the West. So there were 10 camps, and by the red dots here, you can see that almost all of them were very far west, the majority being right along the line of California. And look at the population of them here. That's a lot of people to put in internment camps for 3 years. 3 years of their lives gone, and when their lives were allowed to resume as American citizens, everything they had worked for was gone. They didn't get their homes back. They didn't get their cars back. Nothing. Not really even an apology. So here's what the internment camps looked like. They were huge, and basically they turned them into communal livers. So you lived on this base surrounded by a fence. You could not leave. You slept together. You ate together with other Japanese individuals, and basically you owned nothing. The government gave them supplies to set up their own gardens. They grew their own food. Were they beaten? No. Were they put into ovens and burned like the Jews in the Holocaust? No. But they were imprisoned. They were put into a prison for nothing more than being Asian. So you can't help but see the similarities between what we did to the Japanese and what the Germans did to the Jews, only without the killing going on. But they still were treating them as guilty of something when they were not guilty of anything.
There were a group of Asian men that wanted to join the military, and they were called the Nisei regiments. And they were men that were interned in the camps and volunteered to serve in our military. And their idea was that they would do such a great job that America would see they are not the enemy, they're not spies, they're not here to take us down, and they would free their relatives back home in America in these internment camps. And of course, that's never going to happen. But these men do such a fantastic job that they have more awards than any other group in the entire war of any country. And so they definitely do prove themselves very, very worthy of trust. And we still are not going to release their families. Their families are still in prison back home. Sad stuff for the Nisei Regiment.
Also at home, you have other young men going through a brand new thing called the selective service. You had to sign up for the selective service when you turned 18. I know when I was in high school, they actually came to school before high school graduation and enrolled everybody, all the boys. So you didn't graduate high school unless you were in selective service. Today, that's still a law. They don't come to your school, at least not that I know of. Maybe they do in some places, but you have to go and get yourself enlisted, or I'm sorry, enrolled in the selective service. And if you don't, you can't go to college. You can't enroll in a college. You can't get student loans. They do check on that, and it's illegal for you not to. So that has stuck around since the 1940s. You can see the number of men that were enlisted forcibly between 1942 and 1943. It just skyrocketed. And this is the selective service card that the men would have carried with them with their selective service number. You've heard them say name, rank, and serial number. Well, there it is. So the selective service card, boys were supposed to carry that with them in their wallet to prove, if they ever needed to, that yes, they had signed up for the selective service. It was a law. Other things changed at home too. Suddenly, food was a really big deal. America wanted to make sure that our men fighting overseas had enough food. So the people here at home had to cut back. It was rationed. You didn't go into the grocery store and just grab whatever you wanted like you do today. You actually got tickets in the mail for how much milk and bread and eggs and things like that that you could buy. Now you could get your own. If you had chickens, you could have your chickens laying your own eggs, but you had tickets and you were limited to what you could actually go to the store to get. It was supposed to encourage people to grow their own gardens and have their own livestock and things like that, so that there was more processed food for us to send to our guys serving over in Europe. So when you went to the store, you got what you wanted, and then when you got to the register, not only did you pay for it, but the cashier also took the little coupons out of your little book that the government had mailed you. So if you bought 2 milks, they removed 2 milk coupons, and so on and so forth. And at the end of the month, if you didn't have any coupons left for anything, you weren't getting anything. So that's just the way it was. And you see the posters that went up. Rationing means a fair share for all of us, that kind of stuff. And they actually posted what your fair weekly share was according to your age and gender in all the meat places, especially, just to make sure that you knew that there was a limit and you had to obey it. Again, just like selective service, it was a law. Everybody was expected to play their part in this war, and they did. This war, as horrible as it is to say, because war is horrible, it brought people together in America like nothing ever had before or since. Even children chipped in. They built little wagons for kids, and they were called tin can kids. And these children would go door to door and ask people for tin or metal, anything that they could take with them to the dump yards in town, and they would drop stuff off there. They would make a little bit of money off of it, but it was more the giving to the cause kind of thing. And they would melt things down in the factories and turn them into, weapons or whatever they needed for the war. So the tin can kids did their share. And this is one of my favorite things. I remember my grandmother saying this: use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. That was the big thing of the day. So women were encouraged to sew as much as they could, to darn socks. You didn't buy new things. You couldn't really get a lot of new things. The factories were being used for war items, so it wasn't like you could get new things even if you wanted to. So let's look at the conversion of industry. Whatever a factory was pre-war, it was turned over into whatever kind of industry was closest to the original industry. For instance, if you were a car manufacturer, you might now build planes or tanks or something along those lines. Nylons were illegal to make anymore. The nylon material was used for parachutes for men. So this was a really big deal for women. Nylons were a really big deal. You couldn't be sexy without nylons, but women wanted to play their part. They didn't complain about it. They made this new lotion that you could put on your legs that kind of tanned them a little bit, and then you would take an eyebrow pencil and run it up the back of your leg, because as you can see in the picture, nylons used to have a seam down the back, and that was the sexiest part of all. You had to have the seam. So women would actually help each other draw the line down the back of their legs so it looked like they had nylons on. And my grandmother actually had an old contraption that was supposed to help you center it on the calf of your leg. And you put the pencil in the middle of it, and you would just run it down your calf, and it drew a perfect line with an eyebrow pencil. So you still look sexy for the men, but you couldn't have pantyhose. So you had to fake it. But everybody played their part in any way that they could, and people did not complain about it. You couldn't get new stuff, like I said. Tires for your car. The only way that you could get new tires was buying retreads. If you've ever used a retread, they're horrible. It's tires that they have actually dug new gouges in, basically. They've melted them down, redug the gouges in them. They're just horrible. And I have pictures of my grandfather with these tires, just tons of them, 5 or 6 of them strapped to the top of his car, because he said they blew so often you had to keep a steady supply of them with you. It was dangerous to go to the store without a tire because you probably weren't going to make it. They blew so often. So most people kept extra tires strapped to the tops of their cars. You just couldn't get anything new. And again, people were willing to put up with it for the cause. So there you go. So look how we're going to start using land during World War II. They didn't have a place to put all the explosives, so they actually rented land from farmers out in the middle of basically nowhere. Some even like desert type of stuff in New Mexico, not even farming land. And they paid whoever owned it money to store the bombs. And so people were paid to keep it clear so that, you don't want weeds around the bombs and the weapons of war. Let's keep it clean. So people actually made money keeping these fields safe and clean of debris, and the bombs safe. So what a job, right? Women were very different in World War I than they were in World War II. In World War I, yes, they did work in industry. They worked on planes. They worked on building tanks. We weren't in it that long, so women didn't have a huge opportunity to really get involved in the workforce, but they did play their part. The big thing about the women in World War I is that they still had to remain feminine. You went to work every day with your hair curled. You wore a dress. You wore high heels. I've seen pictures of women sitting on the wing of a plane, with their little white lace-up boots and their cute little hats on with flowers on them. You were still supposed to be feminine and delicate. You were, after all, still a woman, whether you're working in the factory or not. And everyone saw it as temporary. So that's just the way that it was. Here's some great pictures of the women of World War I, and you can see even if they're actually making the bombs, they look all cute and tidy, and they're still wearing their dresses, and they have the little uniforms to keep them very feminine. The lady on the right-hand side, I'm never really sure what she's doing. Every time I look at this picture, I think she must be polishing the bombs. I wonder how much money you make to polish a bomb. But anyway, these women are still supposed to be very feminine, and everybody hired them with the understanding that this is temporary. When the guys come home, you're out. There was never a question about that. So while the women of World War I were off being delicate and cute and sweet and wearing dresses to work and polishing the bombs, the women of World War II were very, very different. You can see the mechanic ladies here in the upper right-hand corner who are diving into the engine. They're not politely sitting on the wing in high heels and, beautiful hats and things like that. Like a World War I woman, you would have seen her looking very clean. But these women are actually mechanics. They were trained to be mechanics, and they got greasy and dirty and went home smelly at night. And you can see in the bottom, they're mostly wearing coveralls, and even the lady in the middle wearing a dress. It's not white and frilly and cute, and they're not nursey looking. They're worker look. to them this time, you know. Off here on the left-hand side, most of you have probably seen at least one version of Rosie the Riveter. The one on the bottom is the most common one. Rosie the Riveter still has makeup on. She still looks pretty. If you look closely at the bottom version of her, her hair is curled, but she does have the coveralls on. Her hair is covered up so that she, you know, can dig right in and get dirty, and she's showing her muscle. The one on the top has something even more to it. Back then, even when I was a kid, women were supposed to be very, very delicate. And my father was very adamant that women eat their sandwiches very, very delicately. A woman doesn't just grab a sandwich and bite into it with that one hand, you know, like you see men do, grab it and just bite into it. A woman tears a little piece at a time off of her sandwich and politely places it in her mouth. But here, Rosie the Riveter is getting ready, you can tell, to take a big old honking chunk out of that sandwich like a man would. So even little tiny things like that, all of a sudden, women didn't have to be delicate little flowers anymore. I mean, look at how muscular Rosie is at the top. They wanted women to think, you are powerful, you are strong, get behind this war and help us fight it and help us win. Nobody had ever said that to American women before, and women just relished it. They poured into the factories. They loved the idea of independence. They loved the idea that they didn't have to be delicate little flowers anymore. And I think a lot of women really thought that this was going to change the world for women forever. Not so much, but we'll talk about that in the next unit. So let's continue on with what was happening in America, and we're going to take a look at some propaganda. Posters like this could be seen all over the place in America as well as other countries that were fighting on the Allied side. So propaganda was supposed to convince Americans that we were fighting this war because basically we're fighting the devil. I mean, you can see this picture here that the devil is, you know, they are taking over the world and we're supposed to save the world from that. So you have to do your part in the war. And the other poster, the quiet, know your place, shut your face, was about not speaking out against the war. If you were an American, to speak out against the war was a very bad thing. You were supposed to do your part in every way that you could, and that included not saying bad things about the war or dissing the president for having us in it. So they literally meant be quiet, know your place, shut your face. They weren't kidding. Posters about Axis powers was also out there. So a lot of them, I hope it doesn't offend anybody, but a lot of them are of Asian descent. So you can see how Tojo here, you can see his little hat in the upper right hand corner or left hand corner. He's Asian. That's supposed to be Tojo. And if you buy war bonds, it will help us defeat the Japanese. And I love the other one on the upper right hand side. If you worked as hard and as fast as a Jap, we'd smash Tokyo a lot quicker. So they're setting up this competition between American workers and the Japanese workers, and the murdering Jap thing down here at the bottom. So these kind of things were all over the place, and it was to get you to continue to hate and not forget about Pearl Harbor, because as long as you didn't forget, then you would give the president and Congress and the military permission to be doing what we're doing in Japan and in Germany. So it was a way to just keep that passion for the war alive and not letting it diminish. I mean, think about 9/11, how quickly that passion for revenge went away and people started screaming, bring our men home. FDR wanted to make sure that didn't happen. He needed to finish this war without the American people being on his back about it. So posters like this went up all over the place with his knowledge, absolutely. So let's wrap up the part that Germany played in this war, and that's going to happen on a day nicknamed D-Day, June 6, 1944. A plan was devised by Dwight D. Eisenhower and George C. Marshall to land on the beaches of Normandy and take France back. So it's a 60-mile stretch of beach, and so you had to bring in a lot of men for this, a lot of men. This is the biggest invasion ever carried off before, and they come in by land, sea, and air. And I'm going to show you a couple pictures here in a minute, but Dwight D. Eisenhower and George C. Marshall planned this operation and carried it out, and it had to be very well planned. You didn't want military men stumbling over top of each other and killing each other. So it had to be very, very carefully planned out, and these guys were the two who did it. So again, 1944 is when the Normandy landings will take place. Of course, you know it as D-Day, also called Operation Overlord sometimes. So American and Allied troops are there to get back France, to take it back. And this is just a summary of it. Dwight D. Eisenhower is the guy in charge. He's the commander. There were very heavy casualties on all sides, but they had actually leaked out some information in advance before the actual landing of all these military guys was planned. They had leaked out a lie to Hitler that this invasion was actually going to take place a little further up north on the beach. And Hitler wasn't sure whether he should believe it or not, but he ended up sending a giant portion of his men to the other site. So when our guys and the other Allies landed at this spot on the beaches at Normandy, the casualties weren't as heavy as they might have been if this plan to kind of divert Hitler's attention hadn't happened. So it was a pretty smart plan. And here you can see from the pictures, the guys coming in parachutes, they're just everywhere. You could almost reach out and touch each other. They had to be careful not to get entangled in one another. There were so many paratroopers jumping. And you can see the boats and the tanks and everything coming on the land all at the same time. It was just a massive undertaking, and it worked.
And here's an even better picture of what it would have been like with all these people dropping from the sky. Remember, this is the biggest conglomeration of military forces in the history of mankind. And you've got people coming from land, from water, from air. One of the men actually said that if you were one of these parachutists and you reached out, you were likely going to touch somebody else. It was very dangerous because there were so many people in the sky. They also had dummies that were dropping out of the sky so that the men on the ground didn't know who was an enemy and who was a dummy. So you've got these objects up there that can't do anything to control their parachute. So just getting to the ground was a really big deal and very dangerous. When our guys landed, they had to run the beach, which I'll show you how small that beach is, but how long it is when you're running for your life. But they had to get to the edge of the cliff that you see here at the bottom and throw up a grappling hook with a ladder attached to it and then climb the ladder. So you're talking a whole lot of time that you are in open area trying to get to the enemy at the top of this landmass. And the Germans actually had a city up here, and I'll show you some pictures of that as well. They were well prepared for us to come. Now, again, they weren't sure this is exactly where we were going to be because we sneaked out that or leaked out that rumor that we were actually going to land someplace else. So even though they're only half of Hitler's men are here, it's actually a city. I mean, they're ready for us. They have business buildings and they have hospitals, and it's all underground. So they are very well protected, and our guys are very much out in the open. And here's that first picture I promised you. You can see the back of my husband's head. He's standing right against the cliff where you would have to climb. And we had the kids that went to Normandy with us run the beach and see. It looks like it's this little tiny distance, but imagine you've got the enemy at the top of that cliff firing down on you. I could have killed every single one of these kids. The distance isn't that short when you are in open ground being fired upon. So this should give you an idea of how very bloody it was. And they say that the water ran red for months after this event because it was such a bloody event and so incredible that the Allied powers succeeded. They had everything against them, everything going against them, and they still won. And here's a picture of that grappling hook. This is actually a monument there at Normandy, so you could get a sense of how dangerous it was for these guys. So you ran the beach. If you made it across that beach, then your job was to start climbing the cliff. And let's see what you would have seen at the top of that cliff. This is what you would have seen. So you have all this old timey barbed wire that we talked about in World War I with those spurs, really close together, super super sharp. So you make it to the top of the cliff, and then you have to overcome this, and of course there will be enemy people there firing on you. So let's see what their camp actually looked like, the German camp on top of this cliff. Now, this is a cannon tower. So you would have these giant, giant, giant cannons. I don't mean like little tiny Revolutionary War cannons. I mean these big, giant things that were protected inside this turret. And it was very difficult for it to get to, for us to be able to destroy that. So it's actually would have poked out the top. The men go inside and load it, and then it pokes out the top. And so it's really difficult to climb in if you're the enemy and get rid of this thing. And if you got up really close to it to try and get inside to kill the men that were operating the cannon, or to tear apart the cannon, again, you have barbed wire. So when you got to the top of the cliff that you can see at the very top of the edge of this picture, that's the cliff that you would have come over. It looked like flat land. So it was an illusion. It looked like flat land because these Germans had dug down under the ground and put up these walls to act as a mask for the buildings that they had there. So when you came over the wall or the cliff, you didn't realize that there were all these rooms and hospitals and living quarters, and you didn't know that. So it was done very well, very secretively. And you see all the kids coming out of these little tiny tunnels. And let's see what it looked like inside. So here's some of the rooms inside. Yes, they had heat. Yes, they had electricity. It's underground, so even in the summer, it wasn't very hot. Big, big spaces that you would never know existed there when you climbed to the top of that cliff. So after the Battle of D-Day is over, or Operation Overlord, many of the families of the Allies that had been killed decided that they would bury them there near the site, the D-Day site, in this very beautiful graveyard. And my husband and I wanted to see if we could find a grave for American soldiers from each state in the United States. And I said to him, let's break up and see if we can find one from all 50. I'm just curious, did we lose somebody from every state? And he said, this is going to take forever. So I said, well, let's just try it and see. And so we did, and within 15 minutes we had all 50 states. I mean, that's how many men we lost there that day and how diverse the population was. So every state in the United States suffered great losses at that one specific battle in this great world war. Just that one battle. That's something to really try and wrap your mind around, right? All right, so eventually, of course, Germany's going to surrender. This was their last really big hurrah. And I want you to see who dies when. So we've got three major players that are going to die in the same month. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt is going to pass away. You see April 12th, 1945. He has a massive heart attack in Florida and passes away. And then Harry Truman is going to take his place and have to deal with the war in the Pacific, Japan specifically. So he dies on the 12th. Mussolini is murdered on the 28th, and then Hitler commits suicide on the 30th. So FDR, after all this long battle, has no idea that Mussolini and Hitler are going to die within a few weeks of him. So he does not get to see the end of the war. Mussolini and Hitler also gone. So make sure, I'm not going to ask you to know the specific dates, but you should know that all three died in April of 1945 and the order. So you've got FDR, Mussolini, and then Hitler. And don't forget, Hitler probably committed suicide because of the horrific murder of Mussolini and what they did with Mussolini's body afterwards, and he did not want that to happen to himself. So in April, all three of these major players are gone. By May 8th, the war in Europe is officially over, and it's called VE Day, Victory Over Europe Day, VE Day, May 8th, 1945. So here you see New York City, Times Square, people coming out to celebrate. Here you have Churchill looking down the crowd in England, London specifically. And then even on in Moscow, the fireworks going off. So we still have Japan to worry about. We have a victory over Europe, but so VE Day, but we still haven't got the VJ Day, victory over Japan. So here we go. We're going to start talking about that.
Okay, so we've gotten rid of the Japanese threat, we've gotten rid of the German threat. I want to go back just a little bit to talk to you about the Holocaust. People are always really interested in this, and I don't think that they know as much as they think they know about the Holocaust. The Holocaust actually started in 1933, although the war doesn't start until 1939. So Hitler gathering the Jews and putting them, in seclusion, it actually started well before the war did. And the elements you can see leading to the Holocaust is this history of anti-Semitism. Remember, Hitler had to give the Germans somebody to blame for all the economic issues going on in Germany. And of course, they all pointed their fingers at Jews. But then Hitler adds this idea of a master race, the Aryan race, in there, and convinces people that you need to get rid of a lot of other people that might be dragging down their population, like the gypsies, the Poles, anybody that had any kind of physical or mental disability, homosexuals. Just the list is astronomical. Jehovah Witnesses, people that we totally forget about being involved in this, were also thrown into the camps and done away with. So Hitler finally, in the end, creates what we call the final solution, and this was Hitler's plan to deal with the Jews specifically, but the other groups are also going to be included in this. And his final solution was the extermination camps, using gas chambers, and eventually he actually had guys sit down at the table together and figure out a better, faster, cheaper way to kill people. They had actual conversations about this, that we're not killing enough people in a day. How do we fix this? How do we make it more efficient? And guess what? They came up with the idea of using Ford's, Henry Ford's assembly line. That's where you get the baskets of people's teeth, golden teeth, glasses, their shoes, their hair. They lined them up and went through these stations with them where you take your clothes off. They pull your teeth out, then they shave your head, then they, take your belonging. It's all set up in stations like an assembly line. And the end of the assembly line, of course, is the gas chamber for you. And then there's a crew that comes into the gas chamber, pulls the bodies out, and throws them into the ovens. And of course, the ovens have to be cleaned, and that's another part of the assembly line, that the ashes will be cleaned out of the ovens and scattered. So this whole process was set up just like a car factory. And there was a time when Hitler actually publicly thanked Henry Ford for his idea of the assembly line. I'm not sure how Ford's ghost felt about that. Maybe he rolled over in his grave, who knows. All right, I've actually been to one of the camps in Austria called Theresienstadt. And Theresienstadt was actually used as a prison camp for a very long time, and we talked about this in World War I. Princeps was held at Theresienstadt and died there, of course. This was actually one of the Holocaust camps, and again, I visited it. So when you went there as a prisoner, you were brought into the very first gate, and you were tagged with a symbol. And the symbol said what group you belonged to. So if you were sprayed with a pink triangle, it meant you were homosexual. If you were sprayed with a purple triangle, it meant you were a gypsy. And of course, you have the Star of David, and you had all these simple symbols. So according to what group you were in, that determined where you were sent into the prison. It was very communal, of course. There wasn't a lot of running water or anything like that. Just very, very cold. Very, very basic. And of course, you can see the oven here that they put them in. So there is a movie that I actually got to sit and watch, and it's going to mess you up a little bit when you watch it. It was the propaganda movie that was sent out by Hitler to show people, the world, how well the Jews and all the other groups were being treated inside of these camps. The only link that I could find, the external link that you're going to have to watch, where it says here, click here for web link to propaganda movie. This is a version that has some music over top of it that's kind of creepy. What I want you to pay attention to, though, is what they're portraying the people doing in those camps. Like, you'll see little kids playing and the women knitting, and the guys laughing, and if you were an SS soldier, one of the first things that you had to do when you came to Tierstedt was to sit in this theater and watch this movie, so that you knew the story that you were supposed to tell the outside world. And then, of course, that same video was also played eventually for the public. But I actually got to sit in those same chairs that the SS soldiers did and watch that movie, and it was horrible to think that that's what the world thought was happening inside these camps, where it was all, fun and games, and the people didn't mind being there, and nobody had any idea how awful it was. So take a look at the movie. Make sure you're clicking on the one that says web link for propaganda movie, and I'll see you on the next slide.
A film was Militarism in 1944 by the order of the Nazis to dispel rumors concerning the extermination of Jews in concentration camps as pure enemy propaganda. This film depicts Terezin as a town given to the Jews so that they could govern it in their own way. The International Red Cross organization should have dispatched the picture drawn. The film vanished in 1945. Only after 12 years was part of it found in Czechoslovakia. In our film, we used this segment of the film, as well as the drawings of artists imprisoned in the Terezin ghetto.
Es geht mir sehr gut in Theresienstadt. Es fehlt mir gar nichts. Je suis très bien à Theresienstadt. Je ne manque de rien.
I'm all right in Theresienstadt. I don't miss anything.
Ja, godt tilpas her i Theresienstadt. Ja, mangler ingenting.
Het bevalt me hier best in Theresienstadt. Ik heb het goed van eten en drinken en een mooie kamer.
January 1942, transportations from Terezin to Riga. Designation O, 1,000 prisoners, 105 survivors. Designation P, 1,000 people, 16 survived. March and April 1942, transportations from Terezin to Izvica. Designation AA, 1,000 people, 7 survivors. Designation AB, 1,000 people, 3 survivors. Designation AQ, 1,000 people, 1 survived. April 1942, a transportation to Piaska. Designation AG, 1,000 people.
So here's some pictures from some of the Holocaust camps, and I do want to reiterate that it was Eisenhower that said, don't help them, don't clothe them, don't do anything, we need to take pictures. And this is not him being a jerk. This is him being worried that one day the world would try to deny this. And by golly, there are people out there who are saying that none of this ever really happened, but we have the proof because Eisenhower made his men go in and take these pictures. So this is Auschwitz here before anything was done to help the people. Pictures, pictures, pictures. Here you see a group of gypsies. Here's a really common sight along the railroad lines. Now this is a railroad line that's taking Jews to the camp, and whenever you had an opportunity to throw something out of the train that you might not need, shoes, bread, clothing, you definitely threw it out, so it looked very trashy along the railroad lines. But the reason is because if there was any way to get a small person, usually a child of course, out a crack in the train, just throw them off the train, you were going to do it. It became pretty obvious very quickly that you were never leaving this train. And so if you could somehow as a group get a kid or a small person out a crack and possibly save them, and that's what you did. You shoved them out that crack, and then they would be able to go and pick up these things along the railroad track, the extra clothes and shoes and supplies, to possibly, hopefully, survive all of this on their own now. So pretty sad evidence of what people were willing to do. And here's another picture, another one of gypsies, and you see this striped look. Please don't watch that movie, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, and think that's how it really was, because it was not. I could go on a rant for that for ages, but please do not watch that movie and think that it is a true to life movie. It's not. So let's look at some statistics here. So we know that they killed, Hitler killed 5 to 6 million Jews, closer to 6 million more than likely, but he also killed 5 million others that tend to get forgotten about. I don't want to say that in a bad way, but the Jews are so vocal about what happened to them, and rightfully so, that a lot of people walk away thinking that this Holocaust only killed the Jews, but it did not. It killed 5 million others as well. So you see the Poles that were killed, the Roma and the Sinti, those are two different tribes of gypsies, anybody with disabilities, homosexual men, and Jehovah's Witnesses. So those groups suffered great losses as well, and we can't forget about them. So Hitler did a lot of damage to a lot of groups across the world.
Once we get to the war in the Pacific, you have a lot of different men in control. We talked about Eisenhower and Marshall over on the German side or the European side fighting, but in the Pacific you have Douglas MacArthur. And Douglas MacArthur, he was a bad dude. He was not afraid of anybody. He knew that it was going to be a really rough fight, that the Japanese were not willing to give in. They were willing to fight to the death. They had already made that very clear. Tojo said it, actually, that they would fight to the death. And Japan is not an easy place to come right up on. It's easy to actually dock a boat along the Japanese harbors, especially if people don't want you there. So it's not like you could just pull your boat up, get off, and start shooting people. It's not going to happen that way. So General MacArthur knew that he was going to have to be really careful about what he did and how he did it. But he's the one that is placed in charge of it. And there's going to be a certain group of islands that he knows needs to be taken over before they can successfully attack Japan from air. They're going to need some bases that they can use to allow the planes to take off from and things like that. So he's going to create a campaign called an island hopping campaign, where he chooses some specific islands to take over, to kind of hop from American soil, hop across these islands across the Pacific to get to Japan. So we're going to talk about a couple of the islands here. The first one we want to talk about is Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima, the Battle of Iwo Jima, is the bloodiest Marine Corps island battle ever. And it took place in February of 1945. So MacArthur starts moving in 44. And he's at Iwo Jima, which is not too far from Japanese waters, in 1945. So Mount Suribachi is the only mountain on the island. You can see the entire island here. It's very, very tiny. And when the men landed there, suddenly, as they were marching their troops across the island, it didn't look like anybody was there. It looked abandoned. As they were marching their men across the island, men were starting to fall, like just fall over. And at first, nobody could understand what the heck was going on. But what was happening was Mount Suribachi and the rest of the island is pure limestone. And limestone, if you don't know this, when you mix it with water, it's easily eroded. So this whole island was just filled with all these catacombs, natural catacombs. And the Japanese had actually gotten to Iwo Jima before our Marines did, and they were hiding under the ground in the catacombs. So you can see here on the left-hand side at the bottom, they've discovered a catacomb, and the Japanese would lay in them, and some of them were shallow enough that they just laid in them and kind of covered up with ground cover and had their guns aimed at the Americans, and they would shoot them when they came by and then cover back up again. Or some of them actually were hidden right under the feet of the Marines, and they would jump out unnoticed and cut the Achilles tendon in the back of the Marines' legs. And once that's cut, you're down. You're down. You're not going to fight anymore. So some of the caves under the island were so big that the Japanese actually had hospitals set up under there. So that should give you an idea of how intricate the caves were and how big and how deep they were. We had no idea. So this was a total surprise to us. And at first, I mean, it just, our guys were getting slaughtered. That's why it ended up being one of the bloodiest Marine Corps battles, because these guys were jumping out of the ground and then jumping back in, and we didn't even know what hit us. So it was a fierce battle. These are just some pictures from the inside of the caves that were discovered, and you can see that they actually had electricity. A man could stand up in some of the caves. They were very deep, so if a Japanese soldier popped out that hole at the top and shot a bunch of Marines, he could jump right back in the hole, and the Americans would have no idea where he was. Even if they shot in his direction, he was already way inside the hole, so it wouldn't matter. But these are just a couple pictures that were taken by Marines after the battle was over. Now you probably recognize this, the Iwo Jima statue. What happened is probably not the story that you know. These guys, the battle was not over. These guys climbed the mountain, Mount Suribachi, and they placed the flag. And the ship sitting off of the island of Iwo Jima saw the American flag and thought that the battle was over. So, of course, they all started honking their horns and screaming and yelling and raising all kinds of cane. And one of the commanding officers, still on the island of on the island of Iwo Jima, knew the battle wasn't over, but decided that he wanted that flag. So the original flag, the first American flag to go up on Mount Suribachi, he thought that, that was a pretty significant thing, and he wanted it to personally keep it. So he sent another group of men up Mount Suribachi. The battle was still raging, but he sends a group of men, kind of just randomly picks a few guys out of the crowd, and says, I want you guys to go up Mount Suribachi with a cameraman. I want you to take down the original flag because I want it. You're going to bring it back to me. And I want you to put up another flag, and I want you to get pictures of it this time. This is going to go down in history. I want pictures. So this is actually a posed picture. It's not a spur of the minute kind of thing like it's always presented. But sometimes people don't realize that there's actually 6 guys, and it is funny how they were chosen so randomly. They're very, very different kind of people. One was actually an Indian, or should I say Native American. One was a doctor. One was a farmer. One was a writer. They're all very, very different, these 6 guys. And they were just, like I said, randomly chosen to go up this mountain or up Mount Suribachi and place a second fake flag. And then the photographer took their picture. 3 of them do not make it off of Iwo Jima. 3 of them do come home. And the 3 that come home are pretty messed up. They have a really hard time getting over the fact that so many of their brothers in arms passed away. The mortality rate for Marines on that island was just astronomical, and they just had a really hard time finding their way past that. Ira Hayes was the Native American, and he actually drank himself to death. He died alone in an alley, just dead drunk, and he vomited and choked to death. So he just could not get over it at all. John Bradley was a doctor, and his son has actually written a story about the Iwo Jima event. But he was a doctor, and he would not talk to anybody about what happened on Iwo Jima. So it was their own private little hell even when they got back. But the Marines do win this battle after many, many, many deaths, and they take over the island of Iwo Jima, and it's a pretty big win. The Battle of Okinawa is another very, very bloody battle. This is the bloodiest island fight of the war for all the different military branches, and this is in April of 1945. So 1945 is a very bloody year. It's going to be the end of the war that year, but it's a very, very bloody war. That year is probably one of the worst, especially when you're talking about the Marines, because they took such a huge hit in Iwo Jima. But you can see the Battle of Okinawa here. You can see a ship that's firing on the island, and again, our guys do win. It's not just Marines this time; it's all the military branches, and they join forces, and they win. So here's the point where you have to say to yourself, all right, we have all these islands. The Japanese have literally run out of gas. That's why there's so much hand-to-hand combat on these islands, and why they're hiding underground and jumping out and slicing Achilles tendons. They're out of gas. So you take over the island of Iwo Jima, you take over the island of Okinawa, and you're close enough to do an airstrike on Japan. So you're in position. What do you do? People that Truman went to ask for advice about this war, and how to end it with the least amount of losses of life, especially after Okinawa and Iwo Jima, all the advisors said, we're going to have to do something drastic, and you're going to have to do it in order to save the lives of our men and the other allies. So, of course, the discussion becomes the atomic bombs.
So on August 6, 1945, we dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, completely devastating that town, of course, and it is a civilian town. It is not a military town, and we immediately asked for surrender, and I don't think Hirohito or Tojo had time to get themselves together before August 7th. Russia declared war on Japan for the first time in all these years. And then on August 9th, still not hearing anything from Hirohito, we dropped the second bomb on Nagasaki. So this is where you get that argument of, did we give them enough time to pull themselves together? Was it fair of us? So Hirohito is of course defeated, but it's still going to take him until August 15th to officially surrender. So there's a lot of controversy over why we dropped that second bomb. Was it justifiable to drop the second bomb? There are some theories out there that say we didn't know how to store that second bomb, so we had to get rid of it. We actually created both of these bombs for Germany. Germany was already out of the war, so we couldn't very well use it on them. So it is a possibility that we dropped both bombs on Japan because we didn't know how to store these things. And, we wasted a lot of taxpayers' money on these bombs that we couldn't use against Germany. So who knows? It could have been as awful as that. What a terrible decision, right? So here's the crew that's going to drop those bombs. It was supposed to be designed so that you couldn't tell which one of the planes actually dropped the bomb. They had several of them go up, and they were supposed to maneuver in such a way that you couldn't tell who did it, but they screwed it up. It was actually a Kennedy in one of the planes that tapped another plane in the air. They didn't kill anybody, but it screwed up the formation, and so when the bomb was actually dropped, it was super obvious that it was the crew of the Enola Gay that did it. But it's going to end the war. And of course, dropping those bombs will lead to VJ Day, Victory over Japan Day, August 15th, 1945.
Of course, there were two separate bombs because you have one for Hiroshima, one for Nagasaki. The first one dropped on the 6th was the one for Hiroshima. Originally, it was named Thin Man after FDR because he was a very tall, thin man. But then when he passed away, they kind of thought maybe they should change the name of it. So they named it Little Boy after Truman because Truman was very small. He was only 5'4". So they renamed it Little Boy, and they actually painted across the side of Little Boy, to Japan with Love, America. And then they had Fat Man for Nagasaki, and of course that one was nicknamed after Churchill. So Fat Man and Little Boy were the two bombs. When the bombs went off, nobody knew really what was going to happen. This had never been done on human beings before. We had tested them in the deserts, but never had it happen to a human being. So you can see the devastation here at the bottom right-hand side. The city's gone. You can see the immediate damage done to a human being because of shrapnel, buildings falling apart, and that kind of thing. The burns, that sort of stuff. But there were some weird things that happened too that we couldn't quite explain. For instance, if you were wearing yellow, it seemed to protect you where other colors didn't. Shadows that were cast because of the explosion were made permanent on the sides of houses, the sides of bridges. And like this one that you see here on the left-hand side, that's actually a permanent shadow of a man standing behind a ladder that was embedded into the building that he was standing next to. That kind of stuff we weren't really sure how to explain. Still don't know all of the long-term effects and why they turned out that way either. It was just, it was an oddity. All of it was an oddity. Now, of course, you have people that were badly burned, like you can see the people here over on the right-hand side. Each one of them has something terribly wrong with them because of the bomb. But there were some odd things, too, that again, couldn't be explained. Like I said, the color yellow protected you. Other colors, whatever you were wearing that day, the pattern of certain colors tattooed itself to your skin. And so this woman hasn't recently been burned. She's been tattooed. This is later. She's healed. This is what her skin now looks like. And you can see the pattern of the dress that she was wearing that day when the light hit her from this bomb. Still don't quite understand that either, how the different colors reacted to it so differently. The next picture is a little bit disturbing. It's going to be about kids and the long-term effects that nobody was prepared for. So these pictures that you're going to see, it's a little rough to look at. It's pictures of children born to people who were at Hiroshima or Nagasaki, and the effects, or the birth defects, I should say, that were a result because of it. So here's the babies. If you need to click to the next page, that's fine. Let's do that now. But you can see that this is what happened down the line because of the genetic altering that the bomb had on the parents of the children.
So MacArthur is going to be the guy put in charge of occupying Japan. The Japanese were absolutely terrified of us, and the truth of it is that Japan is very hard to find a good port for a large ship. And MacArthur's going to come with lots of large ships, and so it's going to take him a while to figure out exactly how to port in Japan. And so in those few days that it takes him to get there, the Japanese are terrified of what's going to happen. And so some people were so afraid and so positive of the evil of America that they actually took their children and threw them off of cliffs to kill them, to save them from torture under American rule. And of course, we were not going there to do anything like that. So we do go in kind of with a heavy fist, not hurting anybody, but changing their culture forever and forever. We demilitarize them. They do have a standing military today, but it's a very, very small one. They could not win a war, definitely. We are their military. We foot the bill for all the military stuff that happens in Japan because these people are scary. We don't want them coming back and raising another great army and trying to take over the world because they got awful daggone close to actually succeeding in it. So we don't want to take a chance. So we pay their bill for the military, and we are their military. We also made them turn into a democracy, so there's voting, and we made it that they had to have a constitution so that Japanese individuals had guaranteed freedoms. And of course, because we took over that military bill, their economy absolutely skyrocketed after World War II. So you've got a lot of nations that are in dire straits because of the damage that's happened and the money that they have to spend to repair, but they are also having to pay to keep their military up. Japan's not. So because we took that giant bill off of their lap, their economy is going to do quite well. And just in case you were wondering, this is actually Hirohito down here. We'll talk about this more in the next unit, but he tried to kill himself. And of course, we're going to save him so we can kill him publicly because that's how it works. All right, so that is the end of World War II. Long unit, super interesting. Can't wait to get into the next unit with you and what happens after this war. How do we all come back? So see you soon.